NATO closes the skies and mines the earth. The war with Russia is about to begin. In The Hague, it was said out loud, Russia is the enemy. Sensation! The Prime Minister of Armenia makes a loud statement. Coup d'etat in Yerevan? Is Russia involved? NATO summit launches defense revolution in Europe and bets on Ukraine. Secret negotiations. A Russian aircraft in the USA. Moscow was shaken. Terrifying explosions. 5 explosions, Vnukovo shut down, and panic in the capital. Kim responds to the call. North Korean soldiers could appear on the front lines as early as this summer. 600,000 Chinese troops are heading to Russia. A blow to Russian intelligence. A unique Russian drone was shot down in the Kharkiv region. NATO enters the war on Ukraine's side. An important decision regarding drones. Meanwhile, the front was stabilized in the Sumy region. All this and more in the new episode of Hotspot. Sensational! The war between Russia and NATO. An urgent decision. This is unavoidable. Poland, the Baltic states, and Finland are urgently strengthening their defenses and reinforcing their borders with Russia. For the first time since the invasion began, Poland is withdrawing from the Ottawa Convention and bringing back anti-personnel mines. At this very moment, everything could begin. Are NATO's actions preventive measures or a signal for escalation? All the details are in this report.
A new Iron Curtain is descending over Europe. If, at the height of the Cold War between NATO and the USSR, it was the Soviet Union that actively built such a barrier on its border, then in 2025, the member countries of the North Atlantic Alliance are now forced to do it themselves.
All NATO countries bordering Russia or Belarus have come to the conclusion that in order to deter a possible offensive, measures are needed that until recently were considered unacceptable.
As a result, 4 NATO countries have announced their intention to withdraw from the Ottawa Convention, the treaty banning the production, stockpiling and use of anti-personnel mines. Finland, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia have concluded that in order to deter a possible offensive, measures are needed that until recently were considered unacceptable.
Russia is not a party to the convention and continues to aggressively use mines, putting us at a strategic disadvantage. In this situation, our armed forces need the freedom to use all possible means to protect people and NATO's eastern flank.
It is expected that by the end of this month, Finland, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia will officially notify the UN of their withdrawal from the treaty, after which they will begin actively producing, storing and deploying anti-personnel mines in their territories. The Finns will be the first to take action, since their border with Russia is the longest among the allied countries.
The Finns are withdrawing from the convention that bans anti-personnel mines. They're going to mine everything there. Well, apparently based on the Ukrainian experience, yes, where indeed such very dense mining was able to stop those small groups of meat assaults, yes, mines work perfectly. Apparently Finland is now going to do the same along its entire border with the Russian Federation.
Meanwhile, in Latvia, which has also withdrawn from the Ottawa Convention, they are in no hurry to mine their borders. The authorities are confident, if necessary, they will do it in the shortest possible time. For now, they are installing anti-tank hedgehogs along the border, digging trenches, and actively fortifying the border area with so-called dragon's teeth.
Right now, we are not planning to deploy mines. This concerns both the existing anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. Of course, we need these mines, they are stored in our warehouses. If it comes to an impending crisis and a real military threat, additional measures will be taken at the border, including the deployment of mines. In peacetime, mines will not be deployed.
But the situation could change at any moment. Acknowledge the countries that are members of the North Atlantic Alliance. While the Lithuanians, for example, are confident that they are still living in peacetime, their neighbors, the Latvians, on the contrary, believe that the war against Russia has already begun.
If you look at the map of all hybrid attacks, from cyber attacks and border provocations to ongoing information campaigns, it becomes clear that the level of hostility from Russia towards Lithuania and the region is unprecedented. Russia could be ready to invade NATO territory within 3 to 5 years, approximately between 2028 and 2030.
However, the dates mentioned are very approximate. The Kremlin has long since stopped relying on logic or common sense in its decisions. Russian troops near the border are actively refurbishing their military bases and moving more and more military equipment to the NATO borders. And this is despite the fact that on the front in Ukraine they are critically short of those very same tanks.
If a Russian soldier's foot has ever set down somewhere, then Russia believes it has some rights to that territory. Well, he's just being blatantly open about it now. Yes, he's not even trying to hide it anymore. He's not talking about any, as they call him, a legalist, right, any kind of legal grounds. Well, it's just everyone knows that by the code, it's ours. By the code, it's ours. You know, the Russian Empire was there, so it's ours.
And it seems that only Ukraine can stop Putin in his ever-growing territorial claims. Experts and analysts agree, if official Kyiv does not hold out, Finland, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia will be next. That is why, while strengthening their own borders, the Baltic countries are actively supplying weapons and ammunition to the Ukrainian armed forces, who are now, in fact, defending not only their own land from the occupiers, but also NATO countries.
Everything is being decided right now in Ukraine.
If the conflict is frozen on terms favorable to the Kremlin, it will be a clear signal to Putin that such barbarism can continue. And then the question arises as to where he might continue this kind of behavior, right? So the first thing that comes to mind is the Baltic countries. Plus, from time to time, there are talks about Kazakhstan.
Moscow is under drone attack again. Strikes are happening in different districts of the capital and the Moscow region. Vnukovo airport is paralyzed. Russians are in a panic. Meanwhile, North Korea is making a comeback. Hordes of North Koreans could be at the front as early as July or August. Shoigu has flown to Pyongyang twice. The details are shocking. The China factor. 600,000 Chinese military personnel have reportedly arrived in Russia for training. And the Russian offensive in the Sumy region has been stopped. The front line has stabilized. You can find all the details in the report.
Ukrainian specialists have found a modernized drone that Russia recently used to attack our country. The device was significantly different from others. It was equipped with an advanced camera, an artificial intelligence system, and a radio communication system that allows remote control from Russian territory.
It should also be noted that this Shahed drone was found to contain the latest Iranian technology designed to counter electronic warfare systems. In other words, we are actually talking not about a Russian UAV, but specifically about an Iranian UAV. It should also be noted that there were no stickers or markings on the design that would indicate its affiliation specifically with the Russian Federation.
The drone was white, and it had stickers made according to the standard Iranian marking system.
So this is not a modified version of the Shahed 131 or Shahed 136 produced at the Yelabuga plant in the Special Economic Zone. We are talking specifically about the supply of Iranian UAVs. Either these are older deliveries, or accordingly they were present at the time of the strike on Iranian territory.
This crucial fact directly and unequivocally refutes the widespread information that the Russians are no longer dependent on Iran and are now producing Shaheds themselves.
Once again, I want to emphasize that this is about ongoing cooperation between the Russian Federation and Iran. This concerns both the supply of components and accordingly technologies. I do not rule out the possibility accordingly of transferring the UAVs themselves for the needs of the Russian army. According to the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, the production of strike drones specifically, the Yerevan 2 is about 170 UAVs per day. At the moment, an increase in UAV production is expected. According to the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, this number could reach up to 190. But this number does not compare accordingly with the figures reported in Western media.
It is also important to note that Ukrainian special services are taking preventive measures to avoid the scaling up of production on Russian territory. On the night of the 26th of June, explosions were heard in Moscow. Local authorities reported a drone attack and the operation of air defense systems. Residents of the Russian capital, as well as the Moscow region, heard the sounds of drones. As we can see, the production of Ukrainian drones is also not standing still. Moreover, new drones are appearing almost every day. Ukrainian pilots are showcasing their new drone without naming it, but they note that the UAV can reach an altitude of 11 kilometers. It is drones that are changing the course of the war and are capable of holding back the occupiers who strike Ukrainian cities and kill civilians.
Russia has switched to a tactic of indiscriminate terror, primarily against the civilian population. The Russian Federation is well aware that there are no real successes on the front line. And the peace talks in Istanbul, announced by the Russian dictator after the 2nd of June, the 2nd of May, in fact, turned out to be fruitless from the Russian point of view. In other words, there are no elements of military political pressure on the Ukrainian leadership. There are no real results on the front line, specifically in Sumy region, Kharkiv region, and accordingly in Donetsk. Let me remind you, the Russian side announced the so-called advance to the administrative borders of the Dnipropetrovsk region. All of these turned out to be nothing more than elements of information and psychological operations by the Russian information machine.
The Ukrainian armed forces have stopped the Russian offensive in the Sumy region. The enemy has not been able to break through in the Kharkiv region. The latest Russian summer offensive as of May-June this year is bogging down just as it did last year, reported the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky.
A powerful blow to Russian intelligence. In the Kharkiv region, fighters from the 3rd Assault Brigade shot down a modernized Supercam drone. A real victory for Ukraine. A new era of drone warfare. Ukraine plus NATO. Joint strategy on unmanned systems launched. Complete joint transformation of military doctrine, powerful support for Ukraine. Norway sends a signal, almost 7 billion in aid in 2025, and an active defense dialogue. What's behind this support and how it changes the rules of the game, find out in this episode. First shoot down and it's already a jackpot. A newcomer destroyed a rare enemy UAV in the Kharkiv region. Fighters from the 3rd Assault Brigade shot down a modernized Russian reconnaissance drone of the Supercam type, which was detected by radars in one of the directions. As soon as Ukrainian FPV drones approached the target, the enemy bird was destroyed. For the crew, this target became yet another valuable catch. And for the new interceptor pilot with the call sign Usul, it was a spectacular debut on combat duty. The destroyed device was likely a Merlin VRA drone with large dimensions and high endurance. It is precisely these characteristics that allow it to conduct high-quality optical electronic reconnaissance. In the video published by the military, Usul shares his impressions. Thanks to intensive training and constant exchange of experience among pilots, even newcomers are confidently taking Russian drones out of the sky. Meanwhile, Ukraine and NATO are developing a joint drone strategy and paving the way for technological integration. Ukraine and NATO are stepping up cooperation in the field of drones. The allies have begun developing a joint strategy for the use of unmanned systems and are deepening cooperation in the technological sphere. This became known during the international expert conference titled Innovation at the Front. The role of drones in modern warfare, organized by the NATO-Ukraine Joint Analysis and Training Center JATC in Tallinn. The event brought together representatives from the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, the Command of Unmanned Systems Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, NATO Command, and the defense industry. Frontline experience into joint alliance standards. The conference served as a launching platform for the creation of an expert community in the field of unmanned technologies, which aims to turn Ukraine's unique combat experience into concrete JET projects. As a result, this will strengthen the defense capabilities not only of Ukraine but of the entire alliance. Special attention was given to tactics for countering Russian fiber-optically controlled drones, integrating UAVs into command, communication and surveillance systems, developing solutions for drone strike operations and field repairs, crew training and countering jamming, spoofing and cyber threats. Drones, artificial intelligence and the future of warfare. Experts also discussed the prospects for drone autonomy and the use of artificial intelligence on the battlefield. There were also ideas presented for strengthening electronic warfare capabilities and next-generation anti-drone systems. NATO Innovation Challenge. Ukrainian developers among the top. The final highlight of the conference was the International NATO Innovation Challenge 2025, dedicated to countering FPV drones with fiber optic control. A total of 162 applications were submitted, 42 of which came from Ukrainian teams. Among the winners are a team name USA, Centradel, also from the USA, and the Ukrainian team Donts, which takes bronze and receives a direct ticket to collaborate with NATO. The winner gets the opportunity to further develop their solutions within the alliance's structures. For Ukraine, this is a direct path to integrating national technologies into NATO standards. But the good news doesn't end there. Ukraine and Norway defense dialogue and firm support. Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine Valery Churkin held a working meeting with the State Secretary of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Eivind Vat Peterson. The key topics of the talks were political support, military assistance, and the overall security situation. This was reported by the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. Russia understands only the language of force. During the meeting, the Ukrainian side informed its partners about the current situation at the front, the consequences of recent massive attacks on rear cities, and intelligence data on the development of the Russian Federation's defense industrial complex. Valery Churkin emphasized, Russia has no intention of stopping. On the contrary, it is actively ramping up the production of missiles, kamikaze drones, and other weapons used to terrorize the civilian population and strike critical infrastructure. According to him, Ukraine seeks a just peace, but for now, the aggressor responds only to force. Ukraine's needs air defense, missiles, and production. During the negotiations, Churkin highlighted the acute need for additional air and missile defense systems, as well as missiles for them. Special attention was given to supporting domestic defense production, which can strengthen national security. Norway's aid will amount to nearly 7 billion in 2025. Valery Churkin expressed gratitude to the people and government of Norway for their extensive defense support. In 2025, its volume will reach nearly $7 billion. For his part, Eivind Van Petersen assured of Norway's unwavering support for Ukraine and noted that Norway understands the scale of the threat well, as it also shares a border with the aggressor country. That's all for today. Tune in tomorrow for more news.
The advance of Russian occupiers in the Sumy region has been stopped. The front line has been stabilized. This was reported by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Alexander Syrskyi. According to him, Russian troops have been stopped at the border, and in certain areas, Ukrainian units are switching to active defense. A special group has been created to strengthen the defense of the Sumy region, new shelters and anti-drone corridors are being built, and logistics are being improved. At the same time, the Ukrainian armed forces have tied down about 50,000 Russian troops, including elite airborne and marine brigades. Our offensive actions in the Glashkovsky district of the Kursk region forced the enemy to send a portion of their troops to defend their own territory. This has significantly reduced the offensive capabilities of the enemy's main force grouping in the Sumy direction. Alexander Syrskyi, Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, on Telegram. Meanwhile, in the Lyman direction, the Russian army attempted to attack near Kharkivka, Ridkodub, Olivka and Torske. In the Pokrovsk direction, Russian occupiers attempted to push back the Ukrainian armed forces in the areas of Poltavka, Malinivka, Myrolubivka, Novosergivka and Dudakne. And in the Novopavlivka direction, the enemy carried out assault operations near Boatir, Fedorivka and Otradne.
The enemy is also increasing pressure on the Novopavlivka sector of the front, because this is part of the Pokrovsk offensive. Accordingly, it's an attempt to advance, and unfortunately, the enemy is managing to make some progress at the junction of the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions. However, the efforts they are making are not leading to any significant changes. For example, on the battlefield, nevertheless, the pressure continues.
In the Pokrovsk direction, drone operators from Ukraine's unmanned systems forces destroyed a Russian army cannon, as well as an enemy cargo truck along with its ammunition. A hit by a Ukrainian FPV drone in the truck bed caused a fire, which after a while led to the entire ammunition load exploding. And drone operators from the Signum battalion used an FPV drone to destroy a Russian Grad multiple rocket launcher in one of the directions. The target was spotted by aerial reconnaissance from the 60th Mechanized Brigade while the launcher was firing at Ukrainian armed forces positions. The Grad didn't even have time to leave its firing position. It was destroyed along with the remaining ammunition.
There are drones, and activity is insane on both sides. Troop movements are basically impossible for carrying out any operations. Nevertheless, the Russians are trying to...
Meanwhile, North Korea may send additional troops to Russia. In addition, Pyongyang continues to supply weapons to the Kremlin. Reuters reports this, citing South Korean intelligence. They believe that Russia is preparing for a full-scale offensive in Ukraine. South Korean intelligence also notes that in exchange for supplying artillery shells and missiles to Russia, Pyongyang is likely receiving technical consultations on satellite launches and missile guidance systems. Over the past day, Ukrainian soldiers have eliminated 1,100 Russian occupiers. The total number of losses for the Russian army since the start of the full-scale military invasion has exceeded 1,015,500 people. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, 7 enemy armored vehicles and 48 artillery systems were also destroyed the previous day. In addition, 107 drones were shot down and 112 units of Russian vehicles and special equipment were hit.
Urgent, a historic summit in The Hague. NATO has named Russia as the enemy. Right now, Western troops are preparing, military factories are switching to a war footing, and this is just the beginning. The most expensive NATO summit has concluded. Europe is launching its defense industry and joining the game. Unprecedented investments in the Ukrainian defense industry. Is the West finally waking up? And why will this summit go down in history? Find out this episode.
The most expensive and shortest meeting in NATO's history. And all of this for one unpredictable and impulsive participant from across the ocean.
Speaker on screen baritone.
At the significant and highly anticipated summit, where, according to diligent Dutch journalists, every single minute of crucial conversation between the esteemed leaders demonstrably cost the country's national budget more than a staggering 1 million euros, a truly historic and momentous decision, was ultimately made to substantially increase defense spending to a significant 5%. This amount consists of 2 components. 3.5% for so-called hard security, meaning funds allocated directly to the NATO military, and another 1.5% for financing infrastructure projects related to defense. These projects can also be implemented, including in Ukraine.
We must protect ourselves from our adversaries, but it would also be fair to the United States. With these 5%, Europeans and Canadians will bring their defense spending in line with that of the United States. So it's not about American taxpayers having to pay more. It's about Europeans and Canadians paying more. And again, this wouldn't have happened, I really mean it, and some people might criticize me, but when I talk to them, they all say, yes, you're right. This wouldn't have happened if you hadn't been elected in 2016, hadn't been re-elected last year, and hadn't returned to office this past January. So I want to thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is a big victory for everyone.
But making a promise doesn't mean allocating funds. First of all, they have to reach the threshold of 5% of the country within the next 10 years. And that's considering that in 2029 the plans might still be revised. Secondly, some alliance members are already saying that the amount is unaffordable for them and that they are unlikely to pay it. But most importantly, as experts point out, is what exactly the funds will be spent on.
This is just a declaration. No one is able to give as much as someone promises. In fact, there were problems even reaching 2%. Different countries counted differently. Some have been counting since World War I. There are still widows. Yes, they finance and count that as defense spending. Of course, those who are under threat spend more money. Poland and the Baltic countries are in a position of threat. So there are expenses, but there is no efficiency. Poland has a GDP greater than Israel, spends more on its military than Israel, and yet doesn't even have 10% of the capabilities that Israel possesses. Because the issue isn't about money, but about real capabilities to influence policy. The Polish army was built as an auxiliary force for NATO, as an auxiliary army for the United States. But what if the United States or other countries decide not to get involved, right? And we can simply make a deal, right? We can just make a simple agreement over our heads.
All modern technologies, and moreover, technologies that have been tested in the conditions of modern warfare, are in the hands of Ukrainians, as experts have repeatedly pointed out. That's why those alliance members who are truly preparing for war are seeking cooperation specifically with Ukraine. As proof of this is the successful meeting on the sidelines of the summit between President Zelensky and Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen.
Thank you very much.
Denmark will become the first country to launch a joint defense enterprise with Ukraine. The details have not yet been disclosed. In addition, in The Hague, Ukrainians signed a contract with the Dutch, who committed to directly finance the production of 600,000 drones by Ukrainian manufacturers. To these, we should also add the decision by the British to help Ukraine's defense forces with frozen Russian assets. Funding for arming the Ukrainian armed forces is a practical step reflecting NATO's declared commitment to Ukraine.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
A mystery is in the air. A Russian government plane arrives in the US. Who was on board and why? are meeting with White House officials under the label Top Secret. What are both sides hiding? At the same time, Putin is under threat of a tribunal. Strasbourg and Kyiv have signed an agreement. The Council of Europe is launching a special tribunal for crimes of aggression. This could mark the beginning of international prosecution against the Kremlin. And final, a NATO versus Trump. What was decided at the summit? How did the personal meeting between Trump and Zelensky go? And what does the future now hold for Ukraine in the alliance? Watch now for the most important updates.
A Russian government plane secretly arrived in the US. The aircraft took off from Moscow and landed in St. Petersburg. After that, it flew to New York and then to Washington. Around midday, the press slash Zakharova stated that this was a routine flight which brought new staff to the US and would pick up those returning from business trips. There is just one nuance. The Il-96 belongs to the aviation fleet of the Special Flight Detachment Rossiya, and only the Russian dictator and high-ranking officials use its planes. That's why Zakharova's statements are clearly questionable. But while everyone is waiting for more details, one thing is certain: Putin and his team will be held accountable for all their crimes. The President of Ukraine and the Secretary General of the Council of Europe have signed an agreement to establish a special tribunal to investigate crimes of aggression against Ukraine. The ceremony took place in Strasbourg. The future special tribunal will make it possible to conduct investigations against the top leadership of the state, who are usually protected by personal immunity. It will also be possible to issue verdicts even without the presence of the accused, particularly against the political and military leadership of Russia and potentially also Belarus and North Korea.
This is an important step in the context of holding a tribunal against the Russian Federation, and it is clear that such agreements generally contribute to the development of the process in this context. But we should also not forget that fundamentally everything depends first and foremost on the situation at the front line, on Ukraine's ability to bring the war to a victorious conclusion, and only then to put Russian war criminals on trial.
And how symbolic it is that the two-day NATO summit, or rather the Trump summit, ended precisely in The Hague. After all, everything was done to appease the President of the United States. The leaders of 32 countries gathered not only to discuss global security, but above all, to persuade Trump not to turn the United States away from the alliance. NATO Secretary General Rutte even called him daddy.
Trump has repeatedly lashed out with criticism both at certain specific politicians and at the bloc countries as a whole. And because of this, there was great doubt about the very existence of the concept of collective security. Let's not forget that, in fact, just a day before arriving in The Hague, he himself said that he perceives this concept differently. And obviously the Europeans who are going through a rather painful process of growing up were stunned by such statements, but they served Trump, let's say, on a silver platter solution that satisfied his ambitions and ego.
The key outcome of the meeting was the adoption of an unprecedented commitment. NATO countries agreed to spend 5% of their GDP on defense by 2035. This is almost twice as much as before. And most importantly for Ukraine, Donald Trump met with Volodymyr Zelensky. The conversation lasted about 50 minutes. According to the Ukrainian president, the meeting was substantive and covered all significant issues, including achieving a ceasefire and real peace, as well as the protection of the Ukrainian population.
A large number of compliments from both sides, in principle, signals to us that there is a certain progress in bilateral relations. How effective this conversation will be, we will see in the near future. Ukraine is offering to buy weapons from America. Yes, no one is asking for aid packages anymore. This is now moving in a constructive direction, which aligns with Trump's own understanding of how relations with Ukraine and Europeans should develop for him.
At the same time, the American president once again did not give a concrete answer as to whether the US is ready to sell Patriot air defense systems to Kyiv. And Trump still hopes that he can reach an agreement with Putin regarding ending the war in Ukraine, but he is surprised that this hasn't happened yet.
Trump himself already understands that fulfilling his bold promises is not as simple as it seemed during the election campaign, and he is trying to build a new strategy for himself. It is obvious that Putin is not interested in a quick end or any kind of end to the war in Ukraine. Let's be honest, in broad geopolitical terms, his troops on Ukrainian territory are the only argument that keeps Putin relevant in the wider discussion among major countries.
Unexpectedly, French President Macron has also called for the resumption of contacts with Russia. He suggested that NATO countries consider returning to dialogue with Putin.
In his opinion, this would allow the EU to engage in discussions about a new security system on the continent.
It seems like a bit of Scholz has possessed Macron, and his signals to Putin about engaging in broad discussions look extremely strange, especially against the backdrop of Macron's own statement. She often fancies himself as Napoleon about sending troops to Ukraine and forming coalitions that are supposed to put more effective pressure on Russia. I think these are some kind of phantom pains from 2022 that have struck the French president at a very inopportune time.
At the same time, in NATO's final statement, Russia is recognized as a long-term threat to the entire Euro-Atlantic area, including the United States.
The Prime Minister of Armenia has made a bold statement. Russia is involved in an attempted coup d'etat. This is a response to the bombings in Iran. How does the Kremlin plan to change the government in Yerevan? What are Russia's intentions and why have they come up with this plan? All the details of this behind-the-scenes operation are in this episode.
Nikol Pashinyan announced that a seizure of power in Armenia had been prevented. The country's prime minister wrote on his social media that the leader of the opposition movement Sacred Struggle, Archbishop Bagrat Galstanyan, and his associates were preparing terrorist attacks.
Law enforcement officers successfully thwarted a truly large-scale and sinister plan orchestrated by the criminal oligarchic clergy to significantly destabilize the overall situation in the Republic of Armenia and ultimately seize power.
On the morning of the 25th of June, Armenia's investigative committee reported that security forces had detained Galstanyan and several of his associates following searches. The investigation is convinced that the leader of the Sacred Struggle movement could not change the government by legal means and therefore was preparing a large-scale unconstitutional coup.
As a result of regular discussions, members of the criminal group decided to form 200 to 250 strike teams, each consisting of up to 25 people with military training, mainly former servicemen and police officers, assigning each team a specific task that they were to carry out at any cost without knowing the tasks assigned to the other groups. To achieve their criminal goal of seizing power in the Republic of Armenia, Galstanyan and other members of the criminal group planned to commit acts of terrorism, namely, to carry out arson attacks that would endanger the lives of civilians, cause serious or moderate harm to health, inflict large-scale property damage, and result in other severe consequences. In particular, they intended to dig tunnels in the city of Yerevan and on other highways of the Republic, and to stage dozens of car accidents on major and busy streets and avenues.
Law enforcement officers came to Archbishop Galstanyan. During the search, he stepped out onto the balcony of his house and, in response to journalists' questions, said, "So it turns out we were engaged in terrorism." In addition to Galstanyan, David Galstan, a member of the Justice faction of the Artsakh National Assembly, businessman Tigran Galstan, and dozens of supporters of the movement have also been detained. On the eve of the arrests, Pashinyan posted a link on his social media to an article from Civic, which claimed that a plan for a coup against the Armenian government was allegedly being prepared.
Our reliable sources within the opposition provided us with the opposition's coup plan, which is a step-by-step action plan, including a list of resources and key figures involved.
In one of the sections of the plan obtained by the publication, among others, former Armenian presidents Robert Kocharian and Serge Sargsyan were mentioned, as well as the recently arrested Russian billionaire Sambel Karapetyan, along with Gazprom Armenia and the South Caucasus Railway, which is owned by Russian Railways RZD.
This confrontation is not personal. It is a confrontation between the secularism of Armenia and certain figures sent by Russia in order to, I would put it this way, to create chaos from within Armenia and install a Russian-backed proxy at the head of power. It is diversifying its foreign policy, including trying to find common ground with Azerbaijan and Turkey. And of course, Russia does not want this.
At the end of May 2025, at a government meeting, Pashinyan stated that Armenian churches resemble storage rooms filled with junk. Later, on his Facebook page, he published a post claiming that Grigor II had broken his vow of celibacy and that the clergyman allegedly has a child. The leadership of the Armenian Apostolic Church claims that Pashinyan has launched a new campaign against the clergy.
The government's anti-church policy is clearly political in nature, and its goal is to undermine the authority of the church, both within the country and on the international stage. These actions threaten the statehood of Armenia, the unity of the Armenian people, and weaken the national spirit.
The Apostolic Church was supported by billionaire Sambel Karapetyan, who holds Russian citizenship. After his statements, he too was subjected to a search. At that time, Putin's spokesperson Peskov stated that Moscow was maintaining contact with the Armenian authorities regarding the detention of Russian citizen Karapetyan.
These are the kinds of unpopular actions taken by Russian oligarchs with Armenian surnames. Whenever they start criticizing Nikol Pashinyan, his approval rating immediately goes up.
In words, Russia claims to be interested in maintaining law and order in Armenia. In reality, however, the Kremlin absolutely does not want to let Armenia slip out of its sphere of influence and is therefore planning various kinds of provocations.
That's all for today. Subscribe to the channel, leave your comments, hit the like button, and catch other news in the next episode of Hotspot.